The house was always quiet, but not the kind of peaceful silence that people enjoy when they rest. It was a heavy, thick silence that filled every corner of the rooms, pressing down on the furniture and the people who lived there. This was the world of the Johnson family, a world that revolved entirely around their eldest son, Ethan. From the outside, everything looked normal. There was a small garden with colorful flowers and a white picket fence that hinted at a happy life. But inside, the air was different. It was charged with a constant, unspoken worry. Ethan was 12 years old, but in many ways, he existed in a place that no one else could visit. He had been diagnosed with severe autism at a very young age, and as the years went by, the gap between him and the rest of the world seemed to grow wider. He was nonverbal, meaning he had never spoken a single word. He didn't point at things he wanted, and he didn't look at people when they called his name. It was as if he was living behind a thick sheet of glass. He could see them, and they could see him, but they could never truly touch. Most days, Ethan spent his time sitting in the corner of the living room. He would rock back and forth, his body moving in a rhythmic, repetitive motion that seemed to comfort him. His hands would often flutter near his face like moths trying to escape a lantern. His parents had tried everything to reach him. They had spent a fortune on doctors, therapists, and special schools. They had filled the house with expensive toys designed to stimulate his brain, lights that flashed in patterns, textured balls, and puzzles that made sounds when solved. But Ethan ignored them all. He preferred to stare at the dust motes dancing in a beam of sunlight or to run his fingers over the rough texture of the living room carpet. His mother often sat in the armchair nearby, watching him. Her heart ached with a pain that never really went away. She remembered the day he was born, the hopes and dreams she had held in her arms. She had imagined him playing soccer, graduating from school, and talking to her about his day. Now, her biggest dream was simply for him to make eye contact with her or to let her hug him without him pulling away in distress. The years of therapy had exhausted her, not just physically, but emotionally. She felt like she was shouting into a deep canyon, waiting for an echo that never came. There were days when she felt completely hopeless, wondering if her son even knew who she was, or if she was just another object in the room, like the lamp or the table. His father carried a different kind of burden. He worked long hours to pay for the medical bills, coming home late in the evening, his tie loosened and his eyes tired. He loved his son deeply, but he didn't know how to connect with him. He would try to play catch or build block towers, but Ethan would just knock the blocks down and walk away. The father often felt like a failure in his own home. He felt helpless against the invisible wall that separated him from his boy. He stopped looking at the family photo albums because the pictures of a smiling, engaged toddler from years ago hurt too much compared to the distant, locked-away boy sitting in the corner now. Despite the heavy atmosphere, there was one small spark of light in the house. That spark was Mia, Ethan's 6-year-old little sister. While the adults saw a patient, a medical case, and a lifetime of struggle, Mia only saw her brother. She didn't understand diagnoses or developmental delays. To her, Ethan was just Ethan. He was the boy who didn't talk much but who let her sit near him when she was sad. She was the only one who could enter his personal space without causing him anxiety. While the parents walked on eggshells, trying not to make loud noises that might trigger a tantrum, Mia was loud and messy. She would run through the hallway with her dolls, screaming with laughter. Strangely, the loud noises that usually bothered Ethan didn't seem to scare him when they came from her. If she dropped a metal tray and it crashed to the floor, Ethan would usually cover his ears and scream. But if Mia laughed loudly or dropped her toy box, he would just pause his rocking for a moment and turn his head slightly toward the sound. Mia treated Ethan with a kind of fearless love. She would bring her crayons and paper over to his corner and scribble wildly, showing him the drawings with pride. "Look, Ethan, it's a dog," she would say. Ethan wouldn't say anything, but he wouldn't run away either. Sometimes, he would even reach out a finger and touch the paper, as if trying to understand what she was doing. The parents watched these interactions with a mixture of jealousy and amazement. They wished they could connect with him the way she did, but they also knew that Mia was the best medicine he had. One particular afternoon, the weather was gloomy, matching the mood inside the house. It had been a bad week. Ethan had stopped eating properly, and the latest report from his specialist had been disappointing. The parents sat in the kitchen, drinking cold coffee, speaking in low whispers about their fears for the future. They wondered who would take care of him when they were gone. The weight of it all felt crushing that day. In the living room, the silence felt louder than usual. Ethan was in his corner, humming a low, monotonous tone to himself, staring at the wall. Mia, bored with her dolls and sensing the sadness in the air, decided to explore. She wandered out of the living room and into the small study down the hall. It was a room that was rarely used, mostly for storage. In the corner of that room, covered by a thick layer of dust cloth, stood the old family piano. It had been a wedding gift from a grandparent years ago, but no one in the house really knew how to play it. It had become just another piece of furniture, a place to stack unread mail and laundry baskets. Mia pulled the dust cloth off. It fell to the floor with a soft thud, sending a small cloud of dust into the air. She looked at the black and white keys with curiosity. She had seen people playing pianos on television. It looked easy enough. You just pressed the keys, and music happened. She climbed onto the bench, her legs dangling far above the floor. She stretched her small fingers out toward the keys. Back in the living room, the parents were still talking about insurance and therapy costs, their voices heavy with fatigue. They didn't hear Mia lift the fallboard of the piano. They didn't hear her take a deep breath. But then, the silence of the house was shattered. Plink. A single, high-pitched note rang out. Then another. Plunk. Mia wasn't trying to play a song. She was just pressing keys to see what would happen. She started hitting a few notes in a row, a clumsy, random rhythm that had no melody. It wasn't music, it was just noise. The sound was jarring and loud in the quiet house. In the kitchen, the parents stopped talking immediately. They looked at each other with wide eyes. The mother felt a sudden spike of anxiety. Loud, unpredictable noises were usually a trigger for Ethan. She braced herself, waiting for the screaming to start. She waited for the sound of him hitting his head or throwing himself on the floor. But the house remained strangely quiet, save for the banging coming from the old piano. In the living room, Ethan stopped rocking. The low hum in his throat cut off instantly. His head snapped up, his eyes wide. He didn't cover his ears. He didn't cry. He turned his body toward the hallway where the noise was coming from. For the first time in years, his focus was entirely on something outside of his own internal world. He was listening. The clumsy, simple banging of his little sister's fingers had somehow cut through the fog that surrounded his mind. He stood up slowly, his movements unusually purposeful, and began to walk toward the sound. Mia didn't know that she was doing anything special. To her, the big black machine in the study was just a large, noisy toy. She was not trying to be a concert pianist, and she certainly wasn't trying to unlock the secrets of her brother's mind. She was just a 6-year-old girl with a lot of energy and a very loud sense of curiosity. She sat on the padded bench, her legs swinging back and forth beneath her, and she continued to press the keys. The sounds that came out were jarring and clumsy. It was a chaotic mix of high-pitched plinks and low, rumbling thuds. There was no rhythm to it, no melody that anyone could recognize. It was just sound, pure and simple. In the kitchen, the silence that had been so heavy just moments before was now completely gone. The noise of the piano rang through the house, echoing off the walls and down the hallway. The parents froze in their tracks. Their coffee cups sat forgotten on the table. The mother looked at the father, her eyes wide with a sudden, sharp panic. They both knew the rules of the house too well. They knew that sudden, loud noises were usually the enemy. For years, they had tiptoed around Ethan, turning down the television, closing doors softly, and speaking in hushed whispers to avoid setting him off. Usually, a sound like this, a banging, crashing noise, would send Ethan into a spiral. He would cover his ears, scream, and sometimes even hurt himself trying to block out the audio assault. The mother braced herself. She waited for the crying. She waited for the sound of things being thrown. She prepared herself to run into the living room and calm him down, to hold his rocking body and whisper soothing words until the storm passed. But the house remained strangely quiet. There was no screaming. There was only the sound of Mia's enthusiastic, terrible playing coming from the study. The father stood up first. "I should go stop her," he whispered, his voice tight. "He's going to lose it." The mother nodded, but she couldn't move. She felt glued to the floor. Something felt different. The air in the house didn't feel like it usually did before a meltdown. It felt anticipatory. Slowly, the two of them walked out of the kitchen and moved toward the living room. They didn't want to startle Ethan, so they moved carefully, stepping softly on the carpet. When they reached the archway of the living room, they stopped dead. Ethan was no longer in his corner. The spot where he usually sat, rocking back and forth for hours, was empty. The blanket he often held was lying on the floor, abandoned. The father looked down the hall, toward the open door of the study where the noise was coming from. He went toward it, the father whispered, disbelief in his voice. He actually went toward the noise. They crept down the hallway, staying close to the wall. They could hear Mia in the study, giggling to herself as she banged out another discordant tune. "This is a good song," she declared to the empty room, hitting a cluster of keys with her palm. Then, they saw him. Ethan was standing in the doorway of the study. He wasn't covering his ears. He wasn't rocking. He was standing perfectly still, his posture rigid and straight. His eyes were locked on the piano, specifically on Mia's hands as they moved across the keys. He looked like a statue, frozen in a moment of intense concentration. The expression on his face was one his parents had rarely seen. He wasn't angry or afraid. He looked fascinated. It was as if he was trying to solve a very difficult puzzle in his head, watching the connection between Mia's fingers and the noise that followed. The parents hung back, hidden by the shadow of the hallway. They were afraid to breathe, terrified that if they made a sound, the spell would break and Ethan would retreat back into his shell. They watched as Ethan took a slow, deliberate step forward. Then another. He moved like he was in a trance, drawn to the sound like a moth to a flame. He walked right up to the piano bench. Mia, oblivious to the tension behind her, continued her concert. She was trying to play a simple nursery rhyme she had learned at school, but she was missing half the notes. It was supposed to be Mary had a little lamb, but it sounded more like a confused animal wandering around a farm. She hit a wrong note and laughed. "Oops," she said. Ethan reached out. His hand moved slowly, hovering over the keys. For a second, the parents thought he might slam the lid down or hit the piano in anger. But he didn't. His long, thin fingers gently touched the smooth ivory tops of the keys. He didn't press them down yet. He just touched them, feeling the cool surface. He seemed to be absorbing the vibration of the notes Mia had just played. Mia noticed him then. She stopped playing and turned around on the bench, a big smile on her face. "Hi, Ethan," she said cheerfully. "I'm playing music. Do you want to try?" Usually, if anyone tried to interact with Ethan this directly, he would pull away. He hated being touched or guided. But this time, he didn't move. He didn't look at her face, but he didn't back away either. He kept staring at the keys. "Come on, scoot over," Mia said, and she wiggled to the left side of the bench, patting the empty space beside her. To the utter shock of the parents watching from the door, Ethan sat down. He sat down next to his sister, their hips touching. He didn't squirm or try to leave. He placed both hands on the keyboard, his fingers poised and ready. For a moment, nothing happened. The room was so quiet you could hear the dust motes settling. Then, Ethan pressed a key. It was the exact note Mia had missed moments ago. A perfect, clear E. Mia clapped her hands. "Yes. That one." She encouraged him. Ethan pressed it again. Then, he moved his finger to the next note. And the next. He played the first 5 notes of Mary Had a Little Lamb. He played them slowly, one by one. It was precise, mechanical, but perfectly correct. He played the simple melody exactly as it was meant to be heard, correcting Mia's mistakes without saying a word. The mother covered her mouth with her hand to stifle a gasp. Tears instantly welled up in her eyes. She grabbed her husband's arm and squeezed tight. He looked down at her, his own eyes shimmering with moisture. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Their son, who struggled to hold a spoon or button his shirt, was playing a melody on his first try. But Ethan wasn't done. He played the simple tune once more. This time, he played it faster. Then, his left hand, which had been resting in his lap, suddenly moved to the lower end of the keyboard. As his right hand played the nursery rhyme, his left hand began to play a deep, rhythmic bass line. He added harmony. He added weight to the song. The simple, childish melody began to change. It swelled and grew. It wasn't just Mary Had a Little Lamb anymore. It was a complex, rich arrangement of the song. It sounded professional. Mia stopped clapping and just watched, her mouth open in surprise. She didn't understand the music theory, but she could hear the difference. It sounded beautiful. It sounded like magic. Ethan's body language changed, too. The rigid tension left his shoulders. He leaned into the piano, his eyes closing as he felt the vibrations travel up through the bench and into his body. He seemed to be in a state of pure bliss. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just reacting to the world, he was controlling it. He was making something that was pleasing to his ears, something that ordered the chaos inside his head. The notes flowed from him, not as a stutter or a struggle, but as a river of sound. The parents stood in the hallway, weeping silently. They didn't know where this ability had come from. They didn't know if it would last. But in that moment, Watching their son play a complex jazz version of a nursery rhyme next to his beaming sister, they felt a hope they hadn't felt in 12 years. The silence was gone, replaced by music, and for the first time, the house felt like a home. The last note hung in the air, vibrating against the walls of the small study before fading into complete silence. Ethan pulled his hands away from the keys and placed them back in his lap. He didn't look around. He didn't seek approval or clap for himself. He just sat there, his breathing slow and steady, as if he had just done something as normal as tying his shoes or drinking a glass of water. To him, the chaotic noise that had filled the room moments ago had likely felt like a release, a way to organize the swirling thoughts in his mind. In the hallway, the mother finally let out the breath she felt like she had been holding for 12 years. Her knees felt weak, and she grabbed her husband's arm for support. They watched their son, who usually struggled to even make eye contact, sitting calmly at the piano. The father's eyes were red-rimmed, his face a mix of confusion and overwhelming awe. He looked at his wife, his mouth opening to speak, but no words came out. What could you say in a moment like this? Their son, the boy they thought was locked away forever, had just performed a musical feat that most adults couldn't do. Mia, sitting next to him, broke the silence. She clapped her hands, the sound sharp and loud in the quiet room. "That was so good, Ethan," she cheered, swinging her legs. "Do it again." Ethan didn't react to her voice immediately. He stared at the piano keys, his fingers twitching slightly. Then, without a word, he placed his hands back on the ivory. He began to play again. This time, it wasn't the nursery rhyme. It was a complex, flowing melody that seemed to come from nowhere. It was sad and beautiful, full of deep chords that resonated in the parents' chests. The parents slowly walked into the room. They were afraid that if they moved too fast, the magic would break, and Ethan would vanish back into his corner. But as they got closer, Ethan didn't stop. He didn't flinch at their approach. He was lost in the music. The mother sat on the floor near the bench, watching his fingers. They moved with a speed and precision that seemed impossible. He wasn't hunting for the notes like a beginner, he knew exactly where they were. It was as if the piano was an extension of his body. For the next hour, the family sat in the study. They didn't speak. They just listened. The music changed from sad to happy to frantic. Ethan played through his entire range of emotions, things he could never express with words. The mother cried quietly, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. For years, she had wondered what was going on inside her son's head. Now, she was hearing it. It was complex, intelligent, and deeply emotional. He wasn't just a boy with a condition, he was a person with a rich inner life. When the sun began to set and the room grew dark, Ethan finally stopped. He stood up abruptly, the spell broken. He walked out of the room, past his parents, and went back to his corner in the living room. He picked up his blanket and began to rock back and forth, ignoring them completely. The music was over, and he was back in his safe, silent world. The parents looked at each other, the reality of the situation sinking in. They were exhausted, emotionally drained, but buzzing with questions. The father stood up and gently closed the lid of the piano. "We have to tell someone," he said, his voice shaking. "We can't keep this a secret. If he can do this, if he really has this gift, we need to know what it means." The next morning, the house felt different. The heavy cloud of despair that usually hung over the breakfast table was replaced by a nervous energy. The father made a phone call he never thought he would make. He contacted a specialist, a woman named Dr. Stevens, who had worked with Ethan years ago but had moved away to a university in another city. He didn't know if she would remember them, but he had to try. He explained what had happened. He told her about the piano, the simple song, and the complex improvisation. Dr. Stevens listened patiently. When he finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Mr. Johnson," she said finally, her voice serious. "This is incredibly rare. But it's not impossible. In the world of autism, we sometimes see something called the savant syndrome. These individuals have spectacular abilities in areas like music, art, or math. But to hear that he played so complexly after hearing a tune just once. I need to see this. I need to see him." 2 days later, Dr. Stevens arrived at the house. She brought with her a young man, an assistant from the university who carried a small keyboard and a stack of sheet music. The atmosphere in the house was tense. The parents were terrified that Ethan wouldn't perform. They were afraid he would have a bad day, that he would refuse to leave his corner, and that they would look like foolish parents who had imagined the whole thing. Ethan was in his corner, rocking back and forth. He didn't look up when the guests entered. Dr. Stevens was gentle. She didn't rush over to him. She sat on the floor a few feet away, observing him. "Hello, Ethan," she said softly. "It's good to see you." He didn't respond. He kept rocking. The parents exchanged worried glances. The mother felt a familiar sinking feeling in her stomach. "He's not going to do it," she thought. It was a one-time miracle. Dr. Stevens stood up and walked over to the piano. She opened the lid. She didn't play anything. She just stood there. Then, she looked at Mia. "Mia," she said with a warm smile. "Would you like to play something for us?" Mia nodded eagerly. She ran to the bench and climbed up. She played the same simple nursery rhyme she had played before, the one that had started it all. Plink, plank, plunk. It was clumsy and out of tune. Dr. Stevens watched Ethan closely. At the sound of the first note, Ethan stopped rocking. He turned his head. Just like before, the sound pulled him in. He stood up and walked toward the piano. He sat down next to Mia, but this time, he didn't push her away. He waited for her to finish. When she hit the final wrong note, Ethan's hands hovered over the keys. "Let's try something different, Ethan," Dr. Stevens said softly from behind him. She reached into her bag and pulled out a simple xylophone. She struck a note. "A high C." "What note is this, Ethan?" she asked. Ethan didn't speak. He reached out and pressed the C key on the piano. Dr. Stevens struck another note. An E flat. Ethan found it instantly. She struck a complex chord, 5 notes played at once. Ethan paused for a split second, his fingers twitching. Then, he pressed all 5 keys on the piano at the exact same moment. He had perfect pitch. He could identify and reproduce any sound he heard. The room went silent. Dr. Stevens looked at the parents, her eyes wide with validation. "He has absolute pitch," she whispered. "That is a gift possessed by less than 1 in 10,000 people. And look at his hands. He understands the structure." She motioned to her assistant. The assistant took out a piece of classical music, a complicated sonata by Mozart, and placed it on the piano stand. He sat down and played the first page. It was fast, intricate, and difficult. He had practiced for years to play it that well. When he finished, he stood up and moved away from the bench. Ethan looked at the paper. He couldn't read music. The notes were just black dots on a page to him. But he remembered what he had just heard. He put his hands on the keys. He played the exact passage the assistant had just played. Note for note. It was perfect. Then, he kept going. He improvised the next part of the song, taking the melody Mozart had written and spinning it into something new, something jazzier and more modern. Dr. Stevens covered her mouth with her hand. The father sat down on the sofa, his head in his hands. The mother wept openly, not out of sadness, but out of pure shock and joy. They had suspected he was talented, but seeing it confirmed by a professional was overwhelming. Ethan played for 10 minutes, lost in the world of sound. He didn't care about the doctors, the tests, or the diagnosis. He just wanted to make the noise that made sense to him. When he finally stopped, he looked up for the first time. He looked directly at Dr. Stevens. His gaze was intense, piercing. "He's not just mimicking," Dr. Stevens said, her voice trembling slightly. "He is composing. He is hearing the music in his head and letting it out through his fingers. This isn't just a trick. This is genius." The simple tune played by a little sister had indeed unleashed something, but no one in the room could have predicted just how vast and deep that hidden genius really was. The silence in the house was gone forever, replaced by the beautiful, terrifying, and wonderful sound of a mind finally waking up. The days that followed Dr. Stevens' visit were not like anything the Johnson family had ever experienced. The house, once a place defined by hushed whispers and the careful tiptoeing of nervous parents, was suddenly filled with sound. It wasn't just noise anymore, it was music. It poured out from the study like water from a broken dam, flooding the hallways and the living rooms with melodies that ranged from heartbreaking sadness to overwhelming joy. The silence that had held them hostage for 12 years was gone, replaced by the constant, rhythmic tapping of piano keys. However, life didn't magically become perfect. Ethan was still Ethan. He still struggled to button his shirts. He still needed help brushing his teeth. He still had days where the world was too loud and too bright, and he would curl up in a ball, covering his ears and humming to block it all out. But now, there was a difference. When the overload became too much, his parents had a new tool. They didn't just have to hold him and wait for the storm to pass, they could guide him to the piano. It became a routine that was as natural as breathing. If Ethan started to get agitated, his mother would gently take his hand and lead him to the bench. The moment his fingers touched the keys, his shaking would stop. The tension would leave his shoulders. He would play a chaotic, crashing storm of music, letting all his anger and fear flow into the instrument, and slowly, the music would calm down. It would become soft and rhythmic. He was soothing himself. For the first time, he had a way to regulate his own emotions. He didn't need to scream, he could play. The parents realized that they weren't just raising a disabled child anymore. They were raising a prodigy, but they didn't know how to handle a prodigy. They were just ordinary people. They knew how to make peanut butter sandwiches and tie shoelaces, but they had no idea how to nurture a musical genius. Dr. Stevens had warned them that this was a rare gift, and if it wasn't handled correctly, it could fade away. She told them they needed a teacher, but not just any teacher. They needed someone who understood that Ethan didn't learn like other people. He couldn't read a book of rules and follow them. He learned by listening, by feeling, and by doing. Finding that person proved to be difficult. The first few music teachers they called didn't understand. They came to the house with dusty old books filled with notes on lines. They tried to force Ethan to read the music, pointing to the paper and saying, This is AC, Ethan. Play AC. Ethan would stare at them, confused and frustrated. He didn't care what the black dot on the paper was called. He cared about how the music sounded. He would slam his hands on the keys in protest, playing a complex, angry chord that made the teacher flinch, and then he would run away to his corner. The teachers would shake their heads and tell the parents that he was unteachable, that he was too difficult, and that perhaps they should just let him play for fun. But the parents knew this wasn't just for fun. This was his lifeline. They refused to give up. Finally, through a recommendation from a local university, they found Mr. Henderson. Mr. Henderson was an older man, a retired concert pianist with white hair and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. He didn't bring any books with him on his first day. He just brought himself and his own pair of worn hands. When Mr. Henderson sat down next to Ethan, he didn't try to teach him scales. He just started to play. He played a simple, classical melody. Ethan watched him. When Mr. Henderson stopped, Ethan reached over and played the exact melody back, but he added a twist at the end, turning it into something bluesy and deep. Mr. Henderson laughed. It wasn't a laugh of mockery, it was a laugh of pure delight. "I see," Mr. Henderson said, nodding his head slowly. "You don't want to read the map, do you? You already know where you're going. You just want someone to drive with you." From that day on, Mr. Henderson became a fixture in the house. He stopped trying to teach Ethan how to read music. Instead, he taught him how to listen. He would play a piece by Bach or Beethoven, and he would explain the emotion behind it. "This part is sad, Ethan. It feels like a rainy day," he would say. Then he would let Ethan try it. Ethan would play it, and he would make it sound even sadder, more beautiful, capturing the feeling of a rainy day better than the teacher had. Mia watched all of this with great interest. She was the one who had started it all, and she refused to be left out. While Mr. Henderson was teaching Ethan about classical composers, Mia would sit on the floor and draw pictures. Sometimes, she would crawl up onto the bench and join in. She couldn't play the complicated notes that Ethan played, but she had a good sense of rhythm. She would bang the low notes while he played the high, fast ones. One afternoon, during a lesson, Mr. Henderson suggested they try something new. "Ethan, why don't you let Mia lead play what she plays?" Mia placed her hands on the keys and played a slow, simple three-note pattern. Dum, da-dum, dum. Ethan listened for a second, his head tilted to the side. Then, he began to weave a melody around her simple rhythm. He played gentle, flowing notes that danced over the top of her heavy bass line. It sounded like a professional duet. The two siblings sat side by side, completely in sync. There were no words between them, but they were communicating perfectly. Mia would change her rhythm, and Ethan would instantly adapt his melody to match her. It was a beautiful example of the bond they shared, a bond that didn't need words to survive. As the months turned into a year, the transformation in Ethan was undeniable. He still didn't speak much, but he was present. His eyes were clearer. He would look at his mother when she walked into the room. He would let his father ruffle his hair. The music had opened a door in his mind, and a little bit of light was shining through into the real world. However, the parents also began to feel the weight of their new reality. They realized that Ethan's talent was too big to keep inside their house. They watched him play pieces that professional pianists spent decades trying to master. They knew that the world needed to hear him. But the thought terrified them. The world could be a cruel place, especially for a boy who was different. They worried about people staring, about critics judging him, about the pressure of public performance. Mr. Henderson sensed their fear. One evening, after Ethan had finished practicing a particularly difficult piece, the teacher turned to the parents. "He is ready," Mr. Henderson said gently. "You cannot hide this light under a bushel. He has a gift that brings joy to people. He needs to share it." The mother shook her head, anxiety rising in her chest. "But he's autistic, Mr. Henderson. He can't handle crowds. He can't handle loud applause. What if he has a meltdown on stage? What if people laugh at him?" Mr. Henderson smiled kindly. "Then we will start small. We won't throw him into a concert hall tomorrow. We will find a small place. A place where people understand. But you have to let him try. Look at him." He pointed to Ethan, who was running his fingers over the keys, experimenting with a new sound. "When he plays, he isn't autistic. He isn't disabled. He is just a musician. And that is who he deserves to be." The parents looked at their son. They saw the confidence in his posture. They saw the peace on his face. They realized that by trying to protect him, they might also be holding him back. They had spent so many years trying to make him normal, and now they had to accept that he was extraordinary. The path forward was scary. It meant stepping out of the safety of their living room and into the spotlight. But as Ethan struck a final, perfect chord, filling the house with a sound that felt like hope, they knew they couldn't say no. The little girl's simple tune had done more than just unleash a talent, it had given their family a future. And now, they had to help him walk toward it. The day of the recital arrived on a crisp, bright Saturday morning. The venue was not a grand concert hall with velvet seats and golden chandeliers, but the local community center, a place usually used for bake sales and town meetings. To the Johnson family, however, it felt like the most important stage in the world. The parents had spent the morning trying to calm their nerves, checking Ethan's bag, and ensuring Mia was dressed in her best dress. Ethan, surprisingly, was the calmest one in the house. He sat in the back seat of the car, looking out the window, his hands resting quietly on his knees. He didn't seem to understand the concept of a performance or stage fright. To him, they were just going to a place that had a piano. When they arrived at the community center, the room was already filling up with people. There were neighbors, friends from school, teachers, and even a few people who had just heard rumors about a local musical prodigy and wanted to see for themselves. The air buzzed with low chatter and the shuffling of feet. For a boy who usually couldn't stand the sound of a vacuum cleaner, the noise level should have sent Ethan running. But today, he was different. Mr. Henderson had been working with him on desensitization, teaching him to focus on the music in his head even when the world around him was loud. He walked in with his parents, his head down, clutching a small stress ball in one hand, but he kept walking. As they waited for their turn, the family sat in the front row. Mia swung her legs back and forth, excited to see her brother play. She leaned over and whispered, "You're going to be great, Ethan." He didn't look at her, but he stopped swinging his legs and tapped his foot once on the floor, a sign that he had heard her. Finally, the announcer called Ethan's name. "And now, please welcome Ethan Johnson to the stage." A hush fell over the crowd as the parents stood up. They didn't just help him walk, they guided him, shielding him slightly from the stares of the crowd. But when Ethan reached the piano bench, something changed. He sat down, straightened his back, and placed his hands on the keys. The anxiety that usually gripped his face melted away. He was home. He didn't look at the audience. He didn't look for his parents. He looked only at the black and white keys. He began to play. He chose a piece by Mozart, a complex and fast-paced sonata that required incredible dexterity. The first notes rang out, clear and sharp, cutting through the silence of the room. The people in the audience stopped shifting in their seats. They stopped whispering. They leaned forward, captivated. The sound coming from the piano was not the clumsy plinking of a student, it was the confident, precise playing of a master. His fingers flew across the keyboard, a blur of motion. He played with a passion that was raw and unfiltered. He didn't hold anything back. The parents sat in the front row, tears streaming down their faces. They held hands so tightly their knuckles turned white. They weren't just hearing music, they were hearing his voice. Every note he played told them something he could never say with words. They heard his intelligence, his frustration, his joy, and his struggle. They saw the hidden genius that Dr. Stevens had talked about, fully unleashed and shining in the spotlight. The father looked at his son and didn't see a disabled boy anymore. He saw a musician, an artist, a genius. When the final chord of the sonata rang out and faded into silence, there was a split second of stillness. Then, the room erupted. The applause was thunderous. People stood to their feet, clapping and cheering. For most performers, this is the best part of the show. But for Ethan, the loud, sudden noise was terrifying. He flinched, his shoulders hunching up toward his ears. He started to slide off the bench, his face scrunching up in panic. The applause instantly died down as the audience sensed his discomfort. People didn't understand, but they respected him. They sat back down, and the room became quiet again. Ethan took a deep breath. He didn't leave the stage. He looked back at the keys. He knew he wasn't done. He had one more thing to play. He placed his hands back on the piano. He started playing the simple, four-note nursery rhyme that Mia had played that rainy afternoon. It was the tune that started it all. Mari had a little lamb. The notes were slow and deliberate. Some people in the audience smiled, thinking he was just playing a child's song. But then, he began to change it. Just like he had done in the living room that first day, he began to weave complex harmonies around the simple melody. His left hand started playing a walking bass line, giving the childish tune a deep, soulful rhythm. He transformed Mary Had a Little Lamb into a bluesy, jazz-infused masterpiece. It was playful and sophisticated at the same time. It was a musical joke, a nod to where he came from, and a display of where he was going all at once. As he played, he turned his head slightly toward the front row. He didn't look at his parents. He looked straight at Mia. She was sitting on the edge of her seat, grinning from ear to ear. Ethan locked eyes with her. It was a direct, intentional gaze. He held that gaze while his hands continued to move lightning fast over the keys. In that look, he said everything he couldn't speak. He said, "Thank you. I heard you, you did this." Mia stopped grinning and just stared back at him, her eyes wide with wonder. She gave him a small thumbs up. Ethan nodded once, a tiny movement, and turned his attention back to the piano. He finished the song with a flourish, his hands sweeping up the keyboard in a final, triumphant cascade of sound. This time, when he lifted his hands, he didn't wait for the applause. He stood up immediately and walked off the stage, straight into his mother's waiting arms. She hugged him tight, not caring if he usually resisted touch. He leaned into her for a brief second, allowing the hug, before pulling away and walking back to where Mia was sitting. He sat down next to her and put his head on her shoulder, exhausted but peaceful. The audience didn't know how to react at first, so they just watched this quiet family moment with reverence. Then, slowly, the applause started again. It was softer this time, more respectful. It wasn't just for the genius music, it was for the human spirit. Later that evening, after the guests had gone and the community center was empty, the family walked back to their car. The night air was cool. Ethan was carrying a small bouquet of flowers someone had handed him. He was ripping the petals off one by one and letting them fall to the ground, watching them drift in the wind. "Today was amazing," Mia said, skipping ahead of them. "Ethan, you're famous." The father put his arm around the mother's shoulders. "He's not famous," he said softly. "He's just Ethan. And today, the world finally got to meet him." They drove home in a comfortable silence. When they walked into the house, the familiar quiet of the living room greeted them. But it didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt peaceful. Ethan walked over to the old piano in the corner. He sat down on the bench. He didn't play a concerto. He didn't play a jazz piece. He just pressed one key, listening to the sound resonate through the house. The parents watched from the doorway. They realized that the hidden genius wasn't just about the music. The genius was in the way Ethan had found a way to bridge the gap between his world and theirs. The genius was in the way Mia had seen him, not as a broken boy, but as a brother. The simple tune had been the key, but the love in the family was the song that would play on forever. As Ethan struck another chord, filling the house with music once again, the parents knew that no matter what challenges came next, they would face them together, guided by the melody of their son's heart.